Red Mist is a controversial, real-life bootleg tape featuring an unaired episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, like the long-lost but recently discovered Suicide Mouse. Red Mist was reportedly created by a now-imprisoned Scottish animator for the series who intended to pass the tape off as Season 4 premiere episode and featured the death of Squidward. Red Mist begins with Squidward preparing to practice the clarinet in his room as SpongeBob and Patrick play merrily outside. Squidward wraps his mouth around the clarinet and is only able to play one note before being interrupted by somebody knocking at the door. He walks down and opens the door, and discovers that a traveling salesman is at his door. The salesman, a Scottish fish, asks if he could have a moment with Squidward's time. Squidward tells him that he isn't interested and slams the door in the man's face. Walking back to his room, the salesman begins knocking again, and Squidward opens the door angrily. The salesman, looking very upset, tells Squidward that the red mist is coming, and proceeds to walk off, confusing Squidward. Squidward walks back to his room and finally begins playing the clarinet. After performing several off-key notes, SpongeBob and Patrick begin laughing outside, interrupting Squidward yet again. Squidward walks over to the window and shouts at the two, telling them that he needs to practice for the concert that he will be performing at. SpongeBob and Patrick apologize with tears in their eyes and walk back to the house. Squidward, unsure of himself, walks back over and begins playing his clarinet again, this time uninterrupted, and the scene fades red over the course of 12 seconds. Perhaps by glitch, the same scene is repeated once more, which is somewhat common, though, in rough cuts of animation. However, this time, the eyes, they were replaced by new, more realistic eyes with red pupils. Clearly, they weren't real, but they were more realistic than CGI or animated eyes. The audio is also completely absent from the scene, save for occasional clicks. After the repeat of the previous scene, a new scene begins, with the same red eyes, but at the theater, where Squidward's playing. The frames in the animation skip every 4 seconds, but the sound remains synced. After an Unruly performance of the song he dubbed Red Mist, SpongeBob and Patrick are seen in the crowd booing Squidward, which was very uncommon for them. The scene pans to reveal the same Scottish salesman sitting next to them, and he too is booing, as Squidward walks back to his home, his head in his tentacles. What's odd is that the scene actually shows him walking to his house, with nothing happening in the background, for 3 minutes and 50 seconds, before abruptly cutting to red for another 20 seconds, just as he arrives at his house. A new scene appears, back at the original cartoon eyes, with Squidward sitting in his chair in the room at night, with a blank look on his face for roughly 30 seconds before starting to sob softly. Again, the audio is completely missing for most of the scene, until the sobbing begins. This is when the sound of a slight breeze through a forest can be heard in the background. It also begins very mildly zooming in on Squidward's face, but that's only noticeable if you compare 10 seconds of frame side by side. The sound of him sobbing can suddenly be heard, very loudly and severe as the screen twitches in on itself briefly. The salesman laughing can also be heard, echoing in the background. After another 30 seconds, the screen blurs and twitches violently, and a single frame flashes over the screen. Upon pausing, exactly on the frame, the viewer can see a real-life photo of a deceased 6-year-old boy laying in the forest in his underwear, whose face has been mangled. Eyes have been popped and stomach cut open with entrails laying beside him. Next to him, the shadow of the photographer. It's clearly visible, with part of the photographer's hand appearing in the right side of the screen. After this photograph is seen, it cuts back to Squidward sobbing, now much louder than before, with what appears to be blood running from his eyes instead of tears, and the sound of the salesman's laugh is still heard. The sound of the wind in the forest is also played, but at a much louder volume now, but with the sound of branches snapping and the screams of a young boy are heard as well. After 20 more seconds, another single frame appears, this time of an 8-year-old girl in the forest, laying on her stomach in a pool of blood, with her back cut open, with entrails piled on top, and the shadow of the photographer is also visible. The scene then reverts back to Squidward, now with the same realistic eyes from before, completely silent and no longer sobbing. The sound of the forest can no longer be heard. Another 3 seconds later and it cuts back to the sobbing, this time piercing loud, with the sound of the forest heard. The screams of both a young boy and a young girl can be heard mixed together as the song Amazing Grace plays on both the clarinet and the bagpipes. During this, 7 frames are seen in black and white of the boy from the first photograph lying in the woods. Over the course of 7 frames, the hand of the photographer, it reaches in and grabs the boy's entrails, as his remaining eye focuses on the man's hand, and it even blinks once. After this, it cuts back to Squidward again, this time staring at the viewer as the sound of the salesman echoes, "Do it," and "the red mist is coming" repeatedly. After 40 seconds of this, the camera quickly pans out to reveal Squidward holding a realistic gun, looking as though it were photoshopped into the scene. Squidward whisks the barrel into his mouth and pulls the trigger. The gun fires, and blood shoots out from his head. On November 7th, 2004, after the initial animation of the storyboards were completed in Fife, Scotland, the tape was delivered to the lead animators and sound editors at Paramount Studios in Hollywood. The tape was taken into the editing room, where it was watched by said animators and editors, as well as 2 16-year-old interns. The tape, which was supposed to feature a rough cut of Fear of the Krabby Patty, instead began with a title card, using the name Red Mist. While thrown off at first, the animators continued watching, discovering that the tape had been heavily tampered with as some sort of cruel, sick joke. As a result, 3 animators, those being Barry O'Neill, Grant Kirkland Jr., and Alyssa Simpson, were sent to the hospital. 1 editor, Fernando de la Pena, retired, and 1 intern, being Jackie McMullen, committed suicide. The tape was sent to the police, who determined that it had been made by Andrew Skinner, a disgruntled animator from Fife, Scotland, who has since been charged with 9 counts of murder, including the murder of the 2 children seen in the tape. Oddly enough, though, after going through the data on the VHS, police discovered that the last edit to the tape had been made approximately 24 seconds before it was watched by the SpongeBob staff. One copy of the tape was made, before police confiscated the original, by Chaz Agnew, writer of this article and the sole surviving intern from that night. Agnew has made various attempts to distribute copies of Skinner's tape, and hopes to secure clearance rights to release it on several online auction websites soon. But for now, this article is all that we have.